So this study focused on looking at a third-party observer nation and how, in a study, how they would view a nation in conflict and what that looks like based on the nation's vulnerability, strength, and their shared identity. So to do it, they did 3 studies. All of these studies were done with Canadian participants so that they were a third party observer. And they did it over the course of 11 years, which part of that was to test on shared identity. So in the earlier studies in 2007 and 2009, Canadians had a stronger sense of shared identity with Americans than they did in 2018 when they did the last study. So that's important to note in the overall study that they do. So all of them were just questionnaires that they gave to various participants, and those groups varied as well. So initially it was university students, later it was just through Canadian websites. They also did it through Amazon's Mechanical Turk. So they got these participants from different places, they were different ages, different ethnicities. And then all of the questionnaires just regarded a international conflict. So the first, well, all 3 actually included the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the US-Iraq conflict. And the third one also looped in a US and North Korea conflict. So most of the information that they got was actually verified between the 3 studies. They were very similarly done. The questionnaires were very similar. And other than the shared identity, a lot of the results were the same, which ultimately show, if we can go to the next slide, that when a nation is perceived as being vulnerable, the justification of their actions are more likely to be seen. Shared identity, though, did play a role. And it was interesting because in one case, when in the earlier studies, when the Canadians were more likely to have a shared identity with the US, even though the US was seen as like the stronger nation in the conflict, that didn't play as much of a role as they did the perceived vulnerability. But there is a link actually between shared identity and the perceived vulnerability. So they suggested maybe either geographically how our countries are located might have been a sense of like they perceive the threat as well. It could have also just been that we're very similar. So there's a sense of that shared threat that they might have. In the later studies, it kind of diminishes a little bit. And so the justification of our actions was deemed a little bit lower. And that might have been kind of a mediator in that process. So, and then when they didn't have a shared identity, though, in some cases, it didn't matter as much. So with Israel, they didn't have a strong sense of shared identity, but they still viewed them as the more vulnerable and thus the more justified in their actions, just from a strict third party, I'm looking in at this. So it definitely plays a role, but it kind of depends on the situation, which the authors kind of evaluate that there's different, psychosocial things that may be going on behind the scenes that are conflicting. And so how they viewed this would be, might differ. But basically it all comes down as well to like the narrative a country shares can play a big impact on how they're viewed by whether they're allies or not, other nations. And in the case of where they are a superpower, they suggest that it's likely that they should probably not play a victim standpoint, and rather try to focus on the shared identity with other nations that may garner more support. In circumstances where they're not a superpower, taking on the role of being a victim is probably the best way to do that. I think overall, though, the thing that shows us in conflict is just how, the value of perceptions. So kind of where you stand in a conflict and your involvement or non-involvement, the information that's given to you can really shape how you see a conflict and how you take action and how you provide justification for things that are done. And it really just varies on the light that the conflict is shown to you.
Yeah, I like the the points that this kind of brings up, you know, in terms of like power dynamics and identity with different power structures. I wonder if like if we transpose this onto like an organization and talked about it in that way, where, you know, it's a little bit more, I think, easier to grasp. Like if there's some outsider, like an HR, like let's say there's HR director, and the HR director is trying to get a handle on this conflict between the head of IT, which is a very small department but still important, and then the head of like sales, which is a much larger report, you know, and they have a bigger budget and all that stuff. So there's like one like superpower versus one kind of smaller but still important other department. And so like how would the HR director be likely to view who's the victim, who's more vulnerable, et cetera? Is it has to do with identify like how much that director personally identifies with the leader on either side, right? And then they can kind of team up, and like they kind of feel teamed up with like, oh, I understand them more, even though they're more powerful potentially. They might be, or I'm more, this side is smaller, so they're more vulnerable. And does that sound right? Like if you transpose it onto that?
Yeah, I think so. And I thought it was interesting too, just the idea that, you know, a shared identity might make you feel more of a sense of like the victimization or
Mm-hmm.
that sense of legitimacy and what they're doing. Um, and I know that was kind of, you know, the larger picture of like in-group bias, right? Like you have an identity there, and so you're just naturally more inclined to feel empathy and compassion for
Right.
who you identify with. Um, but but I think that was a really great analogy and a great way to apply it.
Yeah. Who do you feel more identified with? Who are you friendlier with? Who have you had, I guess, like, you know, better experiences with, more positive experiences with? Maybe one of them you feel like has some a little bit more power over you, so there's more stakes in it, for your relationship with one side. So guys, I guess it speaks too to like, you know, it's hard to be objective when you're aware of both parties. Like, so that's why, you know, calling in a third party who doesn't know either party, has no stakes in the game, way more objective. Like, so if you have these countries, don't have Canada go, you know, negotiate a deal, have like, you know, outside uninterested, you know, negotiators come in and help negotiate a deal, you know.
Yeah, and I think that's important because, you know, we all have bias to some extent, and, you know, in an organizational context too, you know, how do you, you know, it's very difficult to remove somebody from that bias when they
Sure.
have all that information and those feelings already, you know, trying to pull them from it.
Yeah, and they got to have an ongoing relationship with them, like, and who's more powerful and who's got skin in the game. And it's like, if you're an HR director, you got to weigh out all the different relational dynamics. Like, if I piss off the sales department, that might be tough for me going forward, because they're a much more powerful department than if I piss off the IT department. So maybe I should decide, you know, there's a lot of dynamics there when you have an ongoing relationship. Hard to stay objective.
Absolutely.